think was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century? Hi, I'm Ken Yates from Grace Evangelical Society, and for the next few minutes, I'd like to tell you who I think it was. I'd like to nominate the person that I believe was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. It was a man by the name of Barney F. Now, his real name was Don Knotts, and he was a deputy sheriff on this TV show called The Andy Griffith Show. They were in a town called Mayberry, and Andy Griffith was the sheriff, and Don Knotts, or Barney, was his sidekick. And in one of the shows, he is training some associate deputy sheriffs. And Barney is talking to them about what they need to do if they see something that is wrong, or if they see something that is a criminal activity. And he says, when you see it, and he was famous for this phrase, you need to nip it in the bud. Now, I think he was talking about some kind of work on a plant. Well, they got bud on a plant, and if you see something wrong with it, you got to nip it right at the bud so it doesn't spread. And that was his point. Whether he was talking about plants or not, I don't know, because I don't know anything about plants. But he was certainly saying that when you see something that is destructive, when you see something that is bad, you need to cut it off at its source. Now, I say he's a wise philosopher, even though it was a comedy show, because the Lord in the first century said the same thing. He says in Mark chapter 9, starting in verse 42, that if you see something in your life that is destructive to someone else, in the way you treat someone else, he says you need to cut it off. Now, he didn't say nip it. He said you need to cut it off. He gave the example of your hand or your foot. If your hand or foot, if something you do or someplace you go causes you to harm someone else, he said cut it off. Now, obviously, he didn't mean literally, but what he says is take that out of your life. Get it out of your life right away. And he said the same thing for your eye. If your eye offends you, if your eye causes you to stumble. And what he means there in the context of Mark chapter 9 is if you see people in a detrimental way, specifically if you think of yourself as better than other people, nip it in the bud. Or as Jesus said, pluck your eye out. Cut it off at its source. Because if you don't, that attitude and those actions are going to spread and is going to impact so many other things. And there's a great example of this in the Gospel of John. John the Baptist was a very popular preacher, and he was heard by thousands of people in Israel, and they all came out to hear him preach. It had been very easy to be proud. It had been very easy to think of himself in a way that made him more important than he really was, even though he was extremely important because he was the forerunner of the Christ. He was the promised Elijah who was to come. But as people were wondering if he was the Christ, we could say that John the Baptist cut that off. Or in Barney Fife's words, he nipped it in the bud. He says in John chapter 1, verse 20, I am not the Christ. And then in John chapter 3, he reminds the Jews, he goes, I told you from the very beginning, I'm not the Christ. He says that in John chapter 3, verse 28. And that's a great lesson for us. And specifically when we deal with pride, that we need to take it very seriously. Jesus says it's like if you see it, it's like your hand and you're doing something with your hand that reflects that kind of attitude, cut your hand off or cut your foot off or pluck your eye out. And as Barney F would say, just cut it off right at the bud, right from the very beginning. Don't even give it a toehold in your life. Pride can be a problem in the life of a believer. And Barney F, that great philosopher, said it in a way we could remember. When you see it, nip it. Nip it in the bud. That'd be true for any sin, but in the case of John the Baptist, we see it was a sin of pride. If you like this video, I would ask that you would press the like button and even the subscribe button. And remember, keep grace in focus.